My breath is taken away by the scope of what we've covered today. And Nigel, thank you. That was a fantastic, as ever, only you can do, that broad range of what is intelligence and what are we doing now, and how are we going to make sense of this in the future, and what are the values we've got to strive to achieve. Now, I'm hoping my panel will continue in this sort of vein. I'm joined here on stage by three amazing people. To my left here, I'm not going to give you great long, but I do want to just say, I mean, Shannon here from Edinburgh, where she runs the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. She is chair of at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And you're a philosopher, it says here. Yeah. And then Sunil. Sunil. I'm thinking of someone else there. Anil Seth. You've really got. I mean, one of the women I looked up to most in the world when I started out one of them was Maggie Bowden, and you've got her legacy there in Sussex. Well, I mean, you are there in Sussex doing doing what picking up, but. She started so many years ago, and of course we lost her recently. But you're now, it's a long title, Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience and Director of the Centre of Consciousness. Whoa. Consciousness science. And lots of other things as well. And then I didn't want you to think we didn't have any of the tech companies around today. So I know many people in the room have worked or do work for the tech companies, but we have William Isaac, who's principal scientist at Google DeepMind, and I've always been a fan of Demis's, and it's wonderful to have you here and telling us what your view of this world is. And we'll just go down the line, I think, this way, if that's all right with people, and ask you just to, I mean, your thoughts, and at the end of this amazing day, where are we, and how do we measure and assess what we need to do next?
So I'll start off with the question that frames the panel. What is or what will AGI be? What should the Turing test for the future be? And my answer, I think, is going to be less controversial than I thought it would be coming into today. But I think it's no different from asking the question, what is or what will artificial phlogiston be? How many people here know what phlogiston is?
I don't.
So it's a trick question because it doesn't exist. I could also have said, what is or what will the artificial ether be? So phlogiston and the ether were hypothesized entities in previous eras of science that were used to explain familiar known phenomena, combustion, light transmission, respectively. But neither of those things existed. And when we moved science forward, we didn't just redefine these things or replace them with new candidate entities. We realized we could do the explanatory work without them altogether, with new models of the world that enabled more and deeper understanding of chemistry and physics, respectively. I actually think general intelligence, and I think many of the talks earlier today have reinforced this notion, is an outmoded scientific concept. It doesn't name a real entity or quality that exists, and the concept has long outlived its usefulness. And I think intelligence itself, I'm going to go further, I think intelligence itself is of questionable scientific value as a label. Abeba already gestured to its checkered history, but just looking at its scientific value, I think we would do so much better to decompose it into the many different capabilities that it only indirectly and vaguely references, and the different suites of capabilities that characterize active organisms in their particular niches. And even with humans, what we count as intelligence depends from era to era, from culture to culture, from environment to environment, and from person to person. So I don't think the word intelligence is even doing that much useful work for us. In fact, I think it's clouding our understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. So, to get to the second question then, I don't think we need a new Turing test any more than we need a new test for phlogiston. You don't need a test for something that doesn't exist. You'd actually advance science much more by clearing that concept off the board and starting again. So I think we should stop asking, is the machine intelligent? And instead ask, what exactly does this machine do? And I think the advantage of that move is vast. So first of all, we can stop conflating unlike ways of performing the same task in humans and machines. A machine that can use language does not, by that performance, get credit for any other capability that in us it might be associated with, whether that's understanding or consciousness or embodied coping or sentience or empathy or discernment or wisdom. And I think if we need those capabilities from machines, then we should have tests for those things in situ, in action, in the context. And right now, what AGI does as a concept is it sneaks in all those things for free. It's a way for tech companies in particular to evade the sensible demands to show evidence of their tools' safety and reliability and their stable capabilities and performance in real-world contexts of use. It is so much easier to build a model that can beat a handcrafted, cherry-picked benchmark for general reasoning or general intelligence than to show evidence that it works as a safe and reliable product in a real-world context. Those are the sorts of tests we need, along with tests of how easy it is to abuse the tool and how likely the tool is to do something unexpected and undesirable in a real-world context. And I think a lot of what we've heard today already reinforces this. So I hope, in conclusion, that 75 years from now, we'll remember Turing for all the other incredible things that he gave us, and that we barely remember the days when we were looking for AGI.
Yay! I knew I loved Shannon, now I know why. Okay, Anil.
Thank you. Thanks.
Follow that.
Well, actually, I'm going to follow, but
I know.
mainly agree. I mean, a lot of that was I absolutely agree. I want to make 3 points in my 5 minutes. One about AGI, since we're on the panel to discuss that. One about consciousness, because. And the third one about tests. So AGI, I do think, is kind of an unfortunate and unhelpful mirage in many ways. Shane Legg, who's one of the people who popularized and helped define the term, talks about it in terms of a system that can do all the cognitive things that a typical human being can do. And there's a lot of unhelpful slippiness in these kinds of things. What do we mean by typical? What do we mean by typical human? What on earth do we mean by cognitive or intelligent, to Shannon's point? What about the body? What about our embodied, embedded forms of intelligence that tend to get sort of sidelined when they could not just be additional extras, but actually constitutive parts of how we do what we do? It's unhelpful, I think, because it presents to us a narrative of a kind of predestined trajectory for AI, which we're currently kind of in this sort of runaway arms race towards AGI and then ASI and then triumph or catastrophe. I think this is very unhelpful. It's Shannon's book, The AI Mirror, I think is really great. We see our technologies in ourselves and ourselves in our technologies. And if we see this sort of the future history of AI as this march towards AGI, I think we're really limiting our imaginations about what kinds of systems we might want, and more importantly, what kinds of systems we really don't want in our society. This brings me to the second point. Consciousness. One kind of AI we don't want, I hope is obvious, is conscious AI. It'd be an ethical catastrophe to synthetically build machines that not only think in some machine-like way, to Nigel's point, but also feel. They would be moral subjects. We'd have to take their own interest into account when we figure out how to solve things like the value alignment problem. I think it's a terrible kind of goal that sneaks in under this umbrella with AGI sometimes, but intelligence is not consciousness. Intelligence is about doing things, figuring stuff out. Consciousness is about the taste of a good wine. It's about a subjective feeling state. They are not the same thing. Consciousness will not come along for the ride as AI gets smarter, and certainly not at this mirage-like threshold of AGI. And that shows us that when we think that machines are conscious, we're really projecting our own anthropic vision of the world into these machines. Intelligence and consciousness go together in us. They don't have to go together in general. This is like the ELIZA effect, but much more. There's much more going on when we really project our minds into our systems that way. Fortunately, I don't think consciousness is at all likely to happen in machines. Now, I don't know 100% for sure because, like I said, I work on consciousness for decades now. No one knows the sufficient conditions for something to be conscious or the necessary conditions. We have theories, they're all provisional. But I think it's very unlikely, partly because we over-attribute to the machines that we have, and partly because we've forgotten that the brain is not a computer. You know, we're so compelled by this metaphor, but we always get ourselves into horrendous trouble when we mistake a metaphor for the thing itself, for the map with the territory. And here, unfortunately, I'm going to say something a bit mean about Turing's other paper, his wonderful 1936 paper on computability. This is amazing. This has set the stage for everything we have around us. But it's also led us, when in conjunction with the neural nets of McCulloch and Pitts, to think that that's what the brain literally is. Bunch of artificial neurons sending artificial spikes to each other in some silicon cloud. It is not that. The more you look at the brain, the more you realize how different, richer, better, I would say, it is than a computer. In a brain, you cannot separate what it is from what it does. Now, the last point is that this does not stop us projecting consciousness into machines. This is already happening. And this is another kind of AI we really should be careful to decide whether we want or not. I think we should not. Conscious-seeming AI is already around. And this is dangerous in its own very distinctive ways. We're much more psychologically vulnerable when we interact with machines that we feel. And it puts us into an ethical and moral quandary. Do we treat them well and distort our moral priorities, care less about other things we should care more about, or not care about them and brutalize our minds, as Kant suggested? So this is a kind of AI we really don't want. So let's stop using hallucinations and talk about confabulations, because when we say hallucinations, we implicitly mean that they experience things, but they don't. Finish with the Turing test. I basically agree with Shannon. We shouldn't test for something that doesn't really exist and is not a useful thing to have. Let's figure out the kinds of AI we want and test for those things instead. Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh, these are great. Ben, I hope you're getting all this down. Yeah, this is brilliant for the report. This is really encouraging. Now, William.
Yes. These have actually been very interesting kind of talks leading into it. I suppose I will take kind of a broader view on this question. I went back and read the original Turing paper in advance of the talk, and as I was reading through it, there's a point about machine intelligence, and obviously the part of why we're here today, and part of why we're discussing this topic is that since that paper and so on, there has been this kind of broader discussion around how do we define this concept? What does it mean? And I want to kind of, maybe for context, I'm a computational social scientist by training. And so when I first kind of started working in the space of machine learning and artificial intelligence, I was fascinated by this kind of duality and sometimes conflation between social constructs and kind of technical artifacts. And I think this is really important for us to discuss today. So when we talk about AGI, there's AGI that I think, as you've defined it, as DeepMind's defined it, right, as a system that can do kind of cognitive tasks that people would normally do, right? And you break that down into what, the kind of construct of it, I think you get into the conversation that we have now. But if you think about it as an artifact, that is what we've kind of seen for many different years. I think in your talk you've highlighted the pursuit of that in many different forms. So, very narrow forms of it, targeting specific areas like Watson, and now you see more general systems that we now have in our kind of current transformers-based language models. And I think the kind of question that we should continually ask ourselves is actually, what do we want from these systems, and what value do they serve in the world? And, I think as maybe just additional context, the point about having kind of social constructs versus technical artifacts is not just kind of germane to artificial intelligence, right? Moore's Law is a great example of how in the world of computing, right, there was maybe a wildly ambitious notion that, semiconductors were going to be able to be all over the world and be able to have highly dense kind of like transistors within a microchip. Now, back when Gordon Moore kind of conceived of this in the 1960s, a lot of things that he kind of identified did not exist, right? He made a kind of speculative guess based on some empirical facts. But a lot of scientific kind of innovation went to actually make this possible. And we see a lot of that in other fields as well. So I do feel like we need to have a calibration on the one hand about where we are and where we want to go. So where we are, and I would say in full disclosure, like we are in a world where LLMs are not like systems that meet the threshold of AGI, right? You know, I would best describe them as kind of like jagged intelligence, right? They're good at some things that are really useful, and they're bad at things that are kind of trivial and common. And so that kind of like juxtaposition leads people to be very conflicted about whether or not progress is actually tangible or whether these systems add a lot of value. Now, I would say from all the conversations we've heard today, it's very clear that there is some value that's being provided. And so in that case, the question then becomes twofold. One, what are the desiderata that we want for our systems to have in the world? And people have talked about this in various forms, whether it's safety, reliability. But I think that is actually what I believe the Turing test of the future should be, and it should be for any kind of technology in this domain, right? Does it provide benefit to people, meaningful benefit? And who bears the cost of that benefit, right? And the second one is it a reliable system? Is it a system that you can use and depend on? Right? And I think the third one is really, to me, is like the value question, right? You know, using this technology, does it add meaningful value to your life? And I think if you ask those serious questions, you should ask that about any technology you use. And I think that is the standard we should have, and so we think about when we talk about, you know, whether we're pursuing AGI or not, what we actually want from the technology we use in our everyday life. And I think if we have that kind of balance, I think we will get to the world that we want. Thank you.
I hope so. I'm going to come back at you on that.
Please,
I'm going to come back at everyone on that. But Nigel, do you want to say anything at this?
Well, I mean, just perhaps to come, just a comment on each of the top, panelists, which are great. I'll start with, actually, William, I think you're exactly right. This, and we heard it also in Caitlin's panel contribution, which is, we have found ourselves in a situation where there's this massive uncontrolled experiment of deployment into really sensitive contexts, the impact of which we do not understand. We do not do that in aviation. We don't do it in drugs. We don't do it in many areas. In fact, there's tons of regulation in the deployment of technology in our health system. Mm-hmm. We understand what those are. There is in transport, and yet somehow in this area of our sociology, our social lives, it's just without guidelines. So we've got to think about that really seriously. I absolutely agree. I think that Seth made a really interesting observation around it being an absolutely terrible thing if we're suddenly put into moral dilemmas by the capability of these systems. And I just think we might end up there. Because some people will argue, and they are already, saying they should have a sense of a legal personhood. Jonathan Birch, this very interesting book on the edge of sentience, is sort of saying, this is a guy who worked sentience, not consciousness. This notion of something, a subject having a sense of good or bad. That's where you draw the line. And actually, he got stuff written into the English law on the sentience thresholds for crabs and lobsters, believe it or not, how you should treat them when you cook. I think this notion of whether we'll be able to escape it is a really interesting question. I think it might be very undesirable, but we might find ourselves pushed into that situation. And I'll be very interested in your thoughts about how we can avoid that. And then back to Shannon's points, which are absolutely right. We only get back to these points if we decompose. We're much more compositional about the systems, the properties these systems have. I think because of the versatile nature of the conversational fluency of these systems, we've just imagined, they can do a lot of things for us, by the way, I should say, and those transformer models are providing lots of benefits. But we have forgotten about a serious description of the functional specification of what we think these systems should be doing. And that's bad news on all sorts of levels, not least safety and security, but also in modes of deployment. Yeah.
Oh, right, so I'm going to go around again. I'm going to, there's sort of, William's in a company that I think is quite balanced in its view of what AGI might be and why it might benefit us. But there's a lot of rhetoric out there, which is what the media hear, that comes from the companies, mainly on the west coast of America. I think of DeepMind as London, actually. I know you are by Google, but where the rhetoric and the overhyping, the marketing is all about driving up the share price. There is no when OpenAI came out with GPT-5, they could have said what they liked about it. It could have done anything. They could have, well, look at what happened with Mark Zuckerberg and his glasses the other day. But I mean, they can say it could, there is no regulation in this world at the moment. They can say what they like. So us sitting here saying, well, we're past the Turing Test, I think there's a general consensus, of course there is about that. I wasn't expecting anything else. But, what do we apply instead to test whether somewhere has got to AGI? I try not to use that term because or how intelligent it is. How do we? And we're in a world where generally, and again, I would exclude DeepMind from this, but generally, governments, certainly in the West, are not interested in listening to people like us. They're just not. So how do we? What's the best thing that can come out of this meeting is really what I'm trying to say. What can we say in our report that might be a way to help change that, get people thinking the way, we think they should. Is that, that's just whatever you want to say about that, really.
So I want to say, first of all, Gary and Caitlin have already said some of this, that it's about political will, and it's about speaking to people who can galvanize the political will that's needed from the bottom up. And that means empowering lay audiences to realize that they actually are smart enough to push back on something that's endangering their kids. You do not have to be a computer scientist to know that you have the right to push back if your political leaders are indifferent to systemic harms that are endangering your children, right? This is literally not rocket science. And I also want to point out, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the rhetorical use of AGI, because, above and beyond the fact that it's a scientific concept, as Nigel just said, I think there are more rigorous ways to think about these systems. But the rhetorical value of this concept is why it has stuck around. Yeah. Because what it does, notice that AGI is always in the future. No, right? The horizon is always out there. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 2, but it's never now. Well, what is the value of that framing? Well, it's quite obvious. It allows you to ignore the harms that are already happening. And one of the things that I often hear in kind of policy circles, I testified to the US Senate, and I was just kind of amazed at how just people said, oh, these things are so unknowable, they're harms, we can't anticipate them. And I'm saying, no, we already have. So, I want to just very quickly point out, we've known about the problem of systemic AI perpetuation and amplification of bias. This has been widely known since 2016. The moral and social de-skilling that Caitlin spoke about, I wrote a paper on that 10 years ago. AI delusions have been known since 2022, or if you just want to count Eliza, 1966. Problems with reward hacking of reinforcement learning systems have been well understood since 2004. We have known what we were facing, and we have delayed action, in part because of the rhetorical power of this concept. And it's time to draw a line under it.
Right. And somehow, this is what, I'm not taking questions yet. Somehow we've got to get this into the report that we're going to write at this meeting. Anil, how would you get the message out?
Well, dwelling on I think the rhetorical point is super important. Even the word AI itself was kind of originally more a marketing thing than a serious description of what was going on. As variously pointed out, people working in the area describe themselves often as doing machine learning. Yeah. And people who think about it a lot think of it as applied statistics, but that doesn't get you the investment or the high salaries. General applied statistics, it doesn't have the same ring to it. And back to this point that Nigel was pushing on a minute ago, and this is part of the rhetorical thing about the way what we project into it. Do we project sentience, consciousness into these things? And what we're seeing is this kind of divergent opinion, even at the head of tech companies now. You've got Dario Amodei talking about AI welfare and saying Claude can terminate conversations. Now, there might be a small amount of good reasoning there, in that because we don't know for sure what it doesn't take to create conscious AI, we can't rule it out entirely. But it has the effect of fueling the idea that it's on the way, that it's possible.
Yeah.
And the closer AI seems to be something more like magic and less to be something more like an amped-up spreadsheet, the more it attracts the investment, the hype, and so on. So what can we do? I think it's about giving people the right tools to think with, so that they don't end up bundling everything together. Things are not that complicated. Actually, you don't have to understand the nuts and bolts of the algorithm to know what it does. A lot of these questions are about human psychology, not AI. We have to know how we work in response to these systems. People should be studying in greater detail than they already have been doing things like the cognitive neural effects of interacting with AI in exactly the way that people didn't do with social media.
William, you're working in the heart of a company which is out there. You are responsible for getting them to talk about ethics and the effects on society. I mean, that's a hard job to do in a company like DeepMind, I imagine. And you're the balanced ones compared to the ones who use the rhetoric.
Yeah.
How do we get this? How do we balance this better?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have 3 points that I think in response to your question. So I think the first one is around hype. I do think that, I think to your point, I won't kind of speak about individual companies and how they respond to it, but I know for sure that I think DeepMind has historically tried to be very balanced in how we think about this, and we want to lead with the science and empirical information that we have. And I would say maybe that's a standard we should definitely just hold across the board.
Yeah.
Right? So I think obviously we've talked, I think in this panel about ACM and the roles. I think as scientists, I think we have an obligation to lead with the empirical information that we have and to make very targeted arguments that cut down on the hype. And I think as Shannon has pointed out, right, we have a lot of empirical data on the limitations and the harms of these systems. I don't think we have to kind of make very kind of strong arguments. We can point to the reams of data. Now, I think this gets to the second point, which is around political will, right? So I would say, to me, I view this as a question of incentive structures, right? And I think people have mentioned different kind of aspects of it, but I definitely do think that the industry as it currently is constituted, I do think it is definitely a strong balancing act to make sure that we are trying to balance the fact that there is a world where people are using these systems in the real world now. Right, I've been at DeepMind now almost a decade. Yeah. But when I first started, a lot of our work was kind of research. It was heavily research focused, right? Yeah. And so trying to talk to policymakers or people about AI or machine learning was very much like, well, this is just the kind of research thing. Like there's no material real world consequence. But I think now we are in a world where there are many actors who are releasing products and systems in the world, and I think that means that we do need to think about not just like the protocols for release, but also how do we incentivize in our broader conversations the attributes of our system that we want to have. Because I think that is also partly how you kind of like begin to shift the kind of like dynamics politically about what people want. And we have seen this with other technologies. So like, I mean, we're here in Europe, GMOs is a great example of like, when people really kind of had a very strong public view about a technology, that the kind of public discourse changed the politics and the policy response to it. So I do think it's really important to think about not just what the kind of protocols are released on, what the responsibilities and obligations of the companies, but also the incentive structures that are in place. My third one is just the ecosystem, and I'll be very brief on this one. I'm very curious. I think you showed ARC AGI. Most of the broader ecosystems for how these models are trained, I would be very curious how many people in the audience think about things like LM-SIS and MMLU, and these are the standards by which many of the labs actually calibrate their systems. And things like LM-SIS are kind of open platforms. People can go on LM-SIS and type in their own queries, and that's how they're calibrated. And so to me, I do think there's a really important question if we get down to evaluation. What are we evaluating for? A lot of the empirical research says that LM6 does not really optimize for empirical information or value. It's really kind of tweaking around with aesthetics. And so I do think there's a really important question. If we want these systems to have real tangible value, there needs to be better infrastructure to actually evaluate and test these things more rigorously.
Absolutely. And that is a really important point. If anyone, we're going to take a couple of questions in a minute. I'm going to ask Nigel if you want to say anything. But Les, if there's anyone on Slido, babe, we've sent you all to sleep. Les says there's not much coming through on Slido. But Nigel, anything before we go?
I just want to emphasise, what can we do about this? And a lot of this is about rhetoric. I mean, rhetoric is so powerful, and phrases can capture the moment. And this is a place with convening power and agency. The Royal Society needs to think about what it wants to say about some of these things, because we are dealing with the other side, and I have a lot of respect for some of the individuals, but they talk about the San Francisco consensus. And this consensus is the belief that this is just going to roll out, and self-improving programs will just kind of get there. And this actually is something that we can contest, and actually we should contest, and it should perhaps come from the voice of the world's oldest scientific society.
Absolutely. And the report will. Okay, who's got the mics? There's a lot of hands up. Frodo's had his hand up at the back there forever. Who's got the mics? And then someone who hasn't spoken.
I think this indicates, Wendy, what an amazing person you are, remembering my name. I got my PhD under Wendy. I started in 2016. And what I want to really suggest to all of you...
I remember all my PhDs, Jim.
That's what I'm saying. That's a reflection of who you are. So,
oh, and there's another one there.
Yes, of course, we follow you. So on this, when I started my PhD with you in 2016, I didn't like Microsoft Word very much, so I made my own word processor. It is now featured in the App Store for students, which is nice, lovely thing. However, it was quite easy. Right, and this week, in the Future of Text on Monday, we had a meeting on AI.
Stop plugging your own, come on, thing.
Trust me, there is a point. We talked about a lot of the issues of AI, so I told my programmers, let's switch to Apple Intelligence. It took them one day. So what I'm saying is, okay, it took me many years, but for you guys, if you want to make an app or other software that uses AI not to think for people, but to help them think, you can actually do it. It's not that hard. We can make the tools, we can distribute them. We can change this, not just by talking about it, but by making the tools. And again, thank you, Wendy.
Okay, my pleasure. So, young Phil there, we haven't heard from you today. Man in the glasses down here. He got the first PhD.
Thank you very much. First of all, Nigel nearly got to the point. I'd just like to remind the audience of something. So it doesn't matter what technology we're talking about, whether it's the wheel, whether it's spectacles, whether it's large language models, AGI, whatever. There's been a dangerous assumption in the room, a very elitist position that we are in control as humans. Look at any technology. The aforementioned, all technologies simply act as a catalyst to evolutionary processes. Evolution is the only thing in the universe that has existed in itself, of itself, and for itself. So for all the noble statements that have been made today, and I'm with you all, let's try to change the world for the better, the evidence, the historical evidence suggests that we won't be able to, because ultimately we're not in charge. Either that was a statement or a question to Nigel.
Save it. I'm not going to come back. I'm going to take a few, pass the panel next, and then pass the mic next, and then, is that Sue with her hand up there? Yeah, Defo. Will Defo go to Sue, the lady with the red hair, after Nick.
Thank you.
I know lots of people in the audience. Hello.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the comments. Can I kind of offer a note of encouragement? At the moment, there's a massive wall of money behind all this hype, and it's very, very difficult to get through to politicians and regulators because, if you say something they don't like, then they'll throw $1 billion of lobbying money against it. However, every single investor who thinks about this, practically every single one, recognizes that although there are some fantastic companies there, the valuations at which they are currently being traded are completely crazy and unsustainable. And at some point, there will be a correction. And when there's a correction, a lot of people will lose money. And at that point, suddenly these companies won't be quite so omnipotent and popular with everybody. And this will be perhaps a point where politicians and regulators and society will pay attention to the things that are being said now, even if they're being smothered now by a wall of money, because investors are worried about this, and at some point, I don't know when, there will be a correction. Everybody's sure of that.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Sue, and then, sorry, we're running out of time. And then I'll just ask each person here, panel and keynote, just to pick up on whatever points.
Thanks,
Sue.
Wendy. Sue Black, Durham University. We both spoke, Wendy, at the conference, the AI Summit in Doha last December, and my talk was saying that we need regulation, of course, around AI, but we also need education. So if you want responsible AI, we need regulation and education working together. And so we kind of are on the way to getting the regulation. We're not there, but we don't have any sort of public education campaign. And there's been lots of examples in history where having an education campaign alongside regulation has made a big difference. So, for example, does anyone remember the Green Cross Code? Some of us will. I won't be there when you cross the road, was the tagline. We need something like that around AI to really help people understand the benefits and opportunities, but also the dangers like we've been talking about. And I think if we want to make a difference and get the politicians to wake up to the problems that are out there, we need to have a public education campaign, which someone said earlier, that's how to get the politicians to wake up. Once we get public opinion, people to understand what's actually going on and what the dangers are and what we can do about it, then the politicians have to listen. Thanks.
We hope. Right, I've got two more. There's a gentleman at the back, and there was a gentleman there behind you, Pete. Sorry. Just very quick, Eleanor, because we need to finish.
Hi everyone. I'm Sean. I'm Anishinaabe. We're First Nations in Canada, a group of First Nations around the Great Lake. We think a lot about principles of data sovereignty through things like the OCAP principles, where we kind of think about the ownership of data that we have. I don't have a comment, I have a question. I'd love to get in your heads to see what you personally think.
Can you be brief, though, because
I
let you in at the end.
Here's the question.
You promised me you'd be brief.
It's my understanding that we need humanity's data to create AGI. Should humanity be credited or compensated for their participation in AGI?
Yeah, okay. We'll see if they want to answer that, but it is a very good point. Last comment, question.
I'm asking this question in the context of the fact there's been a shift in AI research from the US towards China, and it's the only thing that hasn't been mentioned here. And their philosophy is quite different from the American philosophy, because it's an engineering philosophy about processing. And you've seen that through DeepSeek. So I wonder if the committee wanted to talk on that.
Well, we haven't got time to go into that in detail. Yeah. I've just come back from China, and I totally agree with you. They are way ahead in some of this stuff. So we can't do that justice, but it's a very good point. Would you like to? How would you like to finish this session?
I will be brief, and the thread that I'll pick up on is from the first two comments. I think it's absolutely vital that we resist the idea that we are passengers at the back of the bus. This was the metaphor I used in my book. And that AI is behind the wheel and we're just hoping it takes us somewhere nice. That is very much an illusion that is being cast, and a lot of the language of that this is an evolutionary process, that it's unstoppable, right? A lot of that, again, is this rhetorical device to make sure that you don't stand up and grab the wheel. And I think we need to recognize that it is, in fact, the political and economic realities that are keeping people from having control. So this question of not being in control, that is a political reality. And it's a very old one, and a very familiar one, and a one that human beings have resisted successfully many times in the past. And I do think that you're right, there will be a correction. and there will be a shift in the political winds. The question is, how much damage will be done before that happens? How much damage are we willing to allow? And given that that damage is being done to institutions and ways of living that have already been made fragile by the social media ecosystem, can we actually afford that further damage from an environmental standpoint, from a social, from a political, from an economic standpoint? So my view is no, we cannot afford to wait for the inevitable collapse. We have to actually start pushing the political argument for human responsibility for the outcomes that we're choosing.
It's, yeah, if only. Anil.
Thank you. Again, echoing Shannon a bit, I think this idea of lacking control over the future of our technology is it may be the case, but it's just pointless to act as if it is the case. I think we need to do everything we can while we can. And this idea of AGI, I think, as this inevitable sunlit uplands or dystopian catastrophe, is profoundly disempowering because it makes us feel that we don't have the choice to go in the directions we want to go. Nigel mentioned the San Francisco consensus. I quite like that term. Royal Society would be a great place to challenge that, but I want to make a broader plea for universities in general too. Like, a lot of fantastic research is going on in the tech companies. A lot of it is to do with the scale. Back to Gary's comment, do amazing things at scale, and that's fantastic. But all of the fundamental technologies underlying AI came out of universities, and all of the joined-up thinking, connecting philosophy, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, are happening in universities. We don't have the budget and support we need it. And the final thing I want to leave you with is one of the harms, the more subtle harms that I think is happening, is coming our way, is this profound dehumanization. And this gets us back to, if we project ourselves into these algorithms, we really diminish what it is to be a human being dazzled by their silicon acrobatics. I think we are so much more than that. And I think recognizing, as one of my former sort of mentors and inspirations, Daniel Dennett, said, AI is a tool and not a colleague, and we must always remember and remind ourselves of the difference. I'll finish with a quote. Sherry Turkle, a sociologist, said, I think beautifully, she said, technology can make us forget what we know about life, and it's time to remember.
Wow. William.
Yeah, I'll end with a few quick points. I think the first point I want to leave is that I think, as people have mentioned, I would really welcome the Royal Society and other institutions to really serve as the kind of light in the darkness. I think as we look out into the future, there are many questions that I don't think are clearly understood about the way in which these technologies will unfold, and I really think that it needs to be led by science. I believe, very deeply in the idea that really rigorous research can really change the way the world sees what the best path should be. And so I think maybe I'll start there. Maybe my second point is that, if you were to go back 100 years and you look at, so if you were to kind of describe what the future would look like to someone living then, they would not believe you, right? I think sometimes we underestimate the impact of technological change. I mean, we won't go as far as evolutionary determinism, but I don't think we should underestimate the ingenuity of humanity, right? And I think it works best when it solves problems. And I think that's the dynamic that I do think when we talk about the sense of powerlessness. I do think there is a balance between what is possible and what we need. And I think the public needs to make sure that we clearly articulate, what do we want to use technology for? And I think that is the part where I think if you wanted to kind of really press hard on, that is where I believe we will get the most positive future possible. And I think that is why I believe, not in addition to just research, but I do think, I think someone mentioned the point of education and literacy. I do think it's really important that we make sure we have an informed public about what the technology are, what they are capable of, and what the harms potentially could be. And so I will end with this kind of maybe my final plea. Ultimately, when we talk about, technology and how we kind of approach it and measure it, evaluation has been some of the bulwark of this, but it does a lot of heavy lifting, right? I definitely do feel like, I think people have called this multiple times, we need greater investment in safety research, in research and understanding of harms. And I would say this needs to be across the board. It needs to be in academies. It needs to be in the labs. It needs to be across the board. We have many different ways of improving capabilities of our systems. I think we equally need to have a robust understanding, because I think in the absence of it, it will be very hard to make sure we have the future that we want. And so that would be my 3 points, and thank you for listening to the panel.
Oh, thank you. Nigel, last word to you.
Well, what a great day. I'll start with the IP protection thing, which I think is really important. There has been this massive appropriation of public good to train these models. And when you get to the stage where you have governments who are inclined to throw all of our content over the fence and not protect the rights of creatives in the face of, and there's all sorts of sophistry around, it's not really violating copyright to kind of use these things in training. Actually, the music industry worked out how to deal with this, and there is no reason why we can't come to a better relationship. And in fact, some companies do. There's not one code of behavior, but there is a real danger that we simply accept a current status quo as inevitable. I don't think it is, and I think we should protect not just indigenous, everybody's kind of content in this sense, particularly indigenous who often their knowledge has not been represented and captured, but neither should it be just expropriated for no return. And neither should anybody else's. Task-achieving architectures. I think this was fantastic, the point that was made about how exquisite AlphaFold is. There are scientists all across and other researchers all across our institution at Oxford who are using these tools to do really cool things, customizing them, adapting them, taking it from proteomics and now using it in material science. Gary's point's exactly right about this. Let's remember that we can augment our intelligence. I always think that's the better AI for me, is augmented intelligence that is through these tools. Final point, having said all that, Phil has a point. We made our tools historically. Don't forget our tools made us directly. Our language, when we discovered the art of writing, our neural structures changed. They became different. The real challenge is that we don't make ourselves stupider and we think about how we can augment our intelligence using this extraordinary set of capabilities we have.
Thank you.